to the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. My name is Irina Zuckerman. For those newly joining the program, I'm the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider. With us, we have Dr. Isabelle Vladoiu. She is the founder of the U.S. of Diplomacy and Human Rights. She'll tell us a little and a lot about diplomacy, human rights, civil society, how they intersect, the challenges, the opportunities, and what areas she's had her personal experience in practicing, and what lessons we can all learn from that experience. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Irina. Delightful to be here.
So, could you start a little bit start by telling us a little bit about yourself, your background, how you ended up studying diplomacy and gravitating to this area before founding the institute?
That's a great question. So I started the Institute back in 2019. Before that, I'm a trained lawyer. I trained my entire life to be a lawyer and specifically into the human rights specialist field. And I worked and I collaborated with many organizations around the world, including the UN, the World Bank, and many others. And I always felt like there's still a gap out there to be filled, specifically because a lot of the organizations were either focusing on diplomacy or focusing on just human rights. So the U.S. Institute of Diplomacy and Human Rights came as a natural blend of these two institutions that we deal with in the world. And because my background has been both as a legal professional and a human rights specialist, and also I've dealt with diplomacy since I've been 19 years old.
How do diplomacy and human rights intersect, and how were you able to create this institution and make it work, given the fact that, as you mentioned, diplomacy and human rights people tend to be separate and not necessarily work together?
Yeah, so first of all, I think not only that they intersect, they are together also in. So I'll just explain that. So first of all, diplomacy is the art of engaging in negotiations or collaboration without arousing hostility. The human rights portion of that is the purpose behind it. So in the end, we all want world peace, right? So that's why we are engaging in negotiations country to country. But there's also the aspect of human rights diplomacy, which is how diplomacy and human rights can be achieved through means of diplomatics means, right? So these two fields, although like they are separate, they also work together very, very beautifully.
So let's talk about your institute and what it actually does. How did you manage to convey this issue? Did you manage to get attention, backing, and how did you find who to work with?
Yeah, so the U.S. Institute of Diplomacy and Human Rights is a global think tank. We are currently present in 135 countries around the world. We have regional directors, and we have either volunteers or partners on the ground. I will just summarize the work at the Institute into three big pillars. One is the certification training programs that we do, educating people and raising awareness about issues such as diplomacy, diplomatic protocol, etiquette, human rights, human trafficking prevention. These are very, very important issues that people need to be more aware of. For that, we implemented training programs and educational initiatives. Then the other pillar is our humanitarian campaign. I work for humanity. So I dedicated my life. I left my career. I never wanted to practice law because I felt like there's so much need to help others to get educated. So our programs, Edu for Every Child, Education for Every Child, which is helping kids from unprivileged kids from different parts of the world to go to school for an entire year. And our Let Her Lead program, which is a girls and women empowerment program that helps women to prevent them from becoming victims of human trafficking, child marriage, gender-based violence. And the third pillar of that is our research portion. So I'm a researcher myself. I have a doctorate in global security. I'm actively engaged not only in Washington, D.C. area, but across the globe, collaborating with different researchers and universities as a visiting professor. Also, where we engage, for example, one of the recent issues that we've been working about is femicide side in Latin America, which I've been working with the Organization of American States here in Washington, D.C., to see how we can tackle this problem internationally.
So let's talk about this issue of security. You have a background in global security. At times, I've personally noticed there is a bit of a tension or conflict between the security people and the human rights people, or the security people and the professional diplomats, or even, diplomats who are in public diplomacy sector in in private areas. How do you gap that bridge?
Yeah,
How do
so
you bridge that gap?
that's a great question. And it's not the first time that I'm hearing this. There is a general misconception out there that security only means national security. What I mean and we've been working on as a global security expert is the human security aspect of it, which comes together with human rights and comes together with diplomacy and international relations. So when we talk about security, we talk about everything that it's food, shelter,
Mm-hmm.
climate, everything that surrounds us, right? So issues that affect us all on a daily basis, not necessarily. Now, there is a component of the national security interest that comes into the global security aspect. However, and I agree, there is this big dispute, and there's been cases. I work oftentimes here in the U.S. Congress and advocated for different legislation. For example, one of them was in particular the Human Trafficking Prevention Act, SESTA FOSTA, back in 2018, where they were like the human trafficking prevention. They were like a dispute between internet security and at the same time the security of people or people who can become victims of human trafficking being sold on this website. So there is this dispute between the two fields, and I feel like the more we use diplomacy and human rights to prevent this dispute from like going out of proportions, then we can find a common ground where, because in the end, we all want the security for all, right?
Absolutely. And that brings me to my next point. Can peace be achieved, or can any breakthrough in human rights really can be achieved without securitizing the regions or areas where those problems are occurring? If you have a high conflict zone or a zone experiencing security problems, whether national security or food security or some sort of environmental dysfunction, for instance, water issues or something like that. Can is it possible to work on human rights issues without addressing these underlying humanitarian or security elements first?
That's a great question. And in practice, it's so much more complex to achieve that, right? And
Mm-hmm.
we've seen it. As a human rights advocate myself, human rights expert in the field, sometimes there's so much effort that goes into working on violations that are currently occurring, like situations of war, and less work emphasis on prevention, right? I'm a firm believer that if we work a little bit more on raising awareness and try to prevent violations from even occurring in the first place,
Mm-hmm.
I think that the world will be at a better state today. And that was back in 1948, where the whole entire mission and purpose of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights after World War II was to never happen again, right? However, here we are more than 70 years after the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted, and those rights are still not being implemented uniformly throughout the nations, right? For example, here in the United States, out of the 30 human rights, we only have about 6 of them in the US Constitution. So the more we work on, like, instead of trying to create new rights or trying
Mm-hmm.
to debate the possibility, like, we need to focus on a different area, I think if we go back to the basis, back to getting education on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which talked about all these issues, then it's a better perception, at least, of what's going to happen in the world.
Oh, here's the problem. International institutions, such as they are not perfect. They're only as good as their member states, and the commitments are only as good as the resources allow. And by resources, I don't mean just financial resources, but the human resources and the other agendas and priorities that are being tackled on simultaneously, as well as conditions on the ground. So we have seen a rise in conflicts, a rise in fragmentation, a rise in sectarianism, a rise of in environmental issues, mm, in other issues, and there seems to be a huge disconnect even among so-called democracies and developed countries and Western states in general, uh, between what is seen as priorities by governments, what is seen as priorities by populations, and what is actually in line with what is written in that document. So how do we, this huge disbalance is leading to polarization. We are seeing the rise of populism, conflicts, political unrest and civil unrest. What is there any way to bridge these huge social and political differences? And you know, i- are all these aspirational ideals doomed to failure given the human reality? We have many countries that are essentially dictatorships. There's no real sanctions are in some ways a failing mechanisms. You can't sanction the whole world. You still need to trade. You still need to people still need to travel and communicate. So what is the solution then?
Well, I'm not sure I'm going to be able to give you a solution. What I can tell you is something that I didn't come up with, right? The solution has been given out there, the track to diplomacy, which is actually engaging civil society organizations such as the U.S. Institute of Diplomacy and Human Rights and other organizations together with the governments. So part of the work that we do at the Institute, we are inviting different governments from all around the world to come to Washington, D.C. to get trained in different like rule of law, human rights, diplomacy, diplomatic protocol, and many countries around the world or have already taken or invited me to go to their nations. So this is part of the work that I'm trying to achieve. I'm not saying I have the easy answer or the solution to all of it, but so far I've seen and I've witnessed, for example, in the space of religious freedom, there's so many religious discriminations around the world, and every country and every religion is a minority in one place in the world, right? And there are disputes between like all different churches, even within the same religion. So part of that was the ARFA Act, right? The International Religious Freedom Act here adopted by President Bush. On his administration. So we are currently still working on that and engaging governments around the world and coming together with governments as part of the civil society to try to work together on a solution how to implement religious freedom for all. So just taking that as an example, we can achieve that with every other human rights. Now, I'm not going to say for sure that we will be able to engage like in countries where there's totalitarian leadership, right? However, it is my firm belief, and if you look at the grassroots movement, Martin Luther King, Mahatma Gandhi, like all the civil rights movement, they started with one person who believed in change, who believed that something can be done. I was born immediately after the fall of communism in Eastern Europe, in Romania. So I could still feel, because I was raised by my grandparents, I could still feel the reminiscence of the communism era, right? Even after it was gone. And you could still feel that even like moments in the past. So I'm not saying this change is going to happen overnight, but there's a wave of education, educating the future generations. I want my son and my son's son to actually, be able to live in a better world. And the way that the state of the world is going right now at this pace, where there's absolutely no education about human rights, there's absolutely like even our school systems, we are being taught something that worked decades ago, and it's no longer accurate for today's society, for today's global interest, let's say like that. And we need to adapt our education system. We need to adapt ourselves as citizens and be these global citizens, right? So it's no longer enough for us to look at the governments or the United Nations or any other institutions to do something for us. It is the responsibility, which, by the way, it's one of the human rights in the Universal Declaration, right? The right to responsibility. It's our responsibility as citizens to actually engage actively in helping. And that can be as, using our social media platform and sharing, but pay attention there. We don't want to share the wrong message, the negative message. There's so much negative things and bad things happening in the world. We want to be part of the solution. So I want everyone who's like watching us, listening to us, to look at the solution. Can you be part of the solution? And at USIDHR, We have over 17,000 human rights certified human rights consultant, right? This is part of what I'm teaching them. Be part of that solution. Don't like just expect somebody else will fix a broken system, because we might be the answer to it. I'm not saying we are the answer. We might be the answer. So it's our responsibility to work towards a better place, a better world where we don't have, countries engaging over the democracy of other countries. We've seen like this year was elections and is still ongoing in many countries around the world. There are so many changes. We've seen broken systems, right? That they are not working anymore. Before, the rule of law was the principle of rule of law was respected. Nowadays is no longer there. So what are we going to put in place? What are we going to change in our societies? And I'm not talking about the United States, I'm talking globally. There has to be this change. So it's not enough to like just focus on creating new human rights. It's just about going back to the basics. Why we even had the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We had it so we can prevent these things. Let's start back into using it.
So let's talk about the practical implementation, because you mentioned the Religious Freedom Act and how you're trying to kind of coordinate with governments and civil societies and others to get it to promote this concept effectively. How does it work? Let's say somebody comes to you and decides that they want your services. What happens next?
Well, I do not do services. We are a nonprofit
Mhm.
501(c)(3) charitable organization, right? So it's either a professional who wants to work in the human rights field or in
Sure.
the diplomacy field. They come to us and they get trained. When it comes, if your question is directly addressed to like how do we engage with governments,
Mm-hmm.
it really
What civil
depends.
societies, other civil societies as well?
Yes. Yeah. So, I mean, we work with different institutions and different organizations that they are sending their people, their staff, or their employees to get trained with us so
Mm-hmm.
that they learn, depending on the course they are taking with us, right? It can be a human trafficking prevention training,
Sure.
it can be a diplomatic protocol and etiquette training.
Um, are you able to measure the success of this program?
Yes, we do. Often we measure the success of the program, and so far from the 17,000 certified consultants that we have around the world in 135 countries, and about 52% of these were able to just either get a job promotion or even went beyond that and open up their own nonprofit organization or their own NGOs or their own consultancy business to help others. I wanted to see it as this way. If we are talking, for example, the human rights, as an example,
Mhm.
the human rights consultant training, right? The same way that there are financial consultants and business consultants, and you as a company, you need somebody to help you implement human rights related policies. So the human rights consultant's role is not to advocate and like go. That's the role of necessarily like the lawyers, right? There's human rights lawyers that will do that. A human rights consultant is actually helping companies and governments and individuals implement human rights related policies like non-discrimination policies, anti-trafficking, anti-harassment policies, and anything like that that aligns a company policy with the international laws and international principles.
So I'm going to ask a little bit of a provocative question. Um, there's a bit of a creeping authoritarianism that I've been seeing even in some parts of Europe. How to keep these people who've received training from you, consultants, human rights activists, and others, from being targeted as alleged foreign agents of the United States and so forth, given that they've received training in an US based institution?
Yes, that's a very, very good question, actually, because and often in my line of work, we run into the danger of like getting rejected of even entering into a country. What I tell my students and what I teach everyone who has worked with the U.S. Institute of Diplomacy and Human Rights, here's the thing: I work with any government, even the totalitarian governments, if they want to work and they want to improve their
Sure.
system. I am willing to help them and like see the right path, right? So it's not a matter of like working with one and that doesn't work with the other too. So because our consultants are not activists, they are usually not against government. That's not something
Sure.
that I teach, not something that I preach. I want them to help. the governments actually to succeed and align themselves with the international law principles. Now
Mm-hmm.
it's a matter whether that government or wants it or not, right? And then so far we've not had, honestly, to be honest, we've not had problems. We had students even from China and other, because as long as our whole purpose is education, educating
Sure.
people and raising awareness and working on prevention. I don't necessarily work on, because there are so many human rights organizations that work on after the fact, right? Like writing human rights report. We are not the watchdog. We do
Mm-hmm.
not monitor human rights violations. That's the work of other organizations, which they
Sure.
are doing wonderful work on that. I'm trying to break the pattern and change the paradigm a little bit and just work before violations even occur in the first place. So that's what I'm teaching my students to do.
Well, I think that's great. Have you had the experience of people from really kind of authoritarian states coming back and say, this made a difference. This is what specifically I was able to change and improve.
Yes, and I don't have a specific example about authoritarian countries, because it's always
Sure.
once a student completes the course, it's up to them if they want to share or not. So let's put it out there. We don't force our students or alumni to come back and tell us what they've achieved necessarily, although we are very, very proud and we do wonderful events together, international, where we have like these gatherings. But so, for example, a couple of years ago, we did an international summit on disability rights, which is the first ever summit that we've done, like any organization has done in the world, on disability rights. There are other conferences on disabilities, but this one was specifically on three pillars: bringing the business, bringing the governments, bringing the civil society together. And it was held in Turkey, in Istanbul. And what was achieved after that was, up until that point, for example, there were no taxis that were able to carry a person in a wheelchair that's not detachable, right? So the person is paraplegic and cannot get off the wheelchair. So basically, there's no way how that person can travel from one location to another in a taxi cab. So after that summit, the result of that was changing the laws, and now nowadays people can go to Istanbul and also travel to different places with these special cars too. And that's just one of the like hundreds of other examples that we've changed policies. We've changed. I give the other example with the Sesta Fosta law, with human trafficking in the United States. So we are still active and we're still like working out there to see how we can promote good policy changes.
Mm-hmm. But earlier you mentioned the importance of trying to prevent and even possibly disrupt bad patterns. In terms of actual prevention, are there any success stories that you can point to how this field of diplomacy can actually prevent human rights from being abused?
Right. So a couple of years back, we worked with many organizations in Latin America, right? So countries such as Colombia or Mexico. In the Colombian, I have a particular example there with the organization I was consulting with at that time. They went and they trained the Colombian army, 200,000 military people that were trained in basic human rights education. And at that point, they were like during the battles with the FARC, the militant group. So the direct result of prevention after that was the signing of the treaty between the Colombian government and the FARC's militant group. And also, not only like there was a 90% drop in the killings that are happening. Also here in the United States, in Washington, D.C., our advocates, they go and like talk with different members of Congress. And we work kind of like behind the scenes sometimes. So then, because you don't see one law being passed, that means sometimes we advocated against it, right? So we are making sure that there's no electroshock treatment for children, for example, or any other things that
It's
infringe
terrible.
human
The
rights.
fact
Yeah.
that's even being mentioned as a possibility is is absolutely terrible.
Yeah, so there are a lot of things that thankfully we were able to prevent from like even starting to grow into a big thing. And even like working with different groups from different countries around the world, a lot of like the diaspora here in Washington, D.C., it's very, very diverse. Well, I work for groups with like Ethiopians, Ukrainians, and like different groups that are here in Washington, D.C. And then I just, we are trying to find a common way where they can continue living in another country. And now their rights have been upheld, right? The same with the people the Hispanic community here in Washington, D.C. A lot of them are not speaking English. Actually, Spanish is one of the official languages in Washington, D.C. So I work with the D.C. Mayor's Office on Latino Affairs to do training and instruction also for them so that they understand their rights, and that can be something as easy as knowing what's a good salary and like what they are not allowed to pay you, right? So it can be something very, very simple to something very complex.
That's incredible, but yeah, this is definitely important work that you're doing. But here's another question, also a little bit provocative, because I've had some unfortunate experiences, but also very positive experiences, and I've seen a lot of both cross-cultural communication. It can be on the one hand, a wonderful way to kind of get to know other ways of thinking, other paradigms, and other perspectives. On the other hand, it could be a huge obstacle if you just don't really know or understand cross culture. It can be a huge communications obstacles, because of real differences or simple misunderstanding. Have you had experience in having to overcome such divides, and any stories about how you can build rapport effectively and find a common language, and what happens if it doesn't work out?
Yes, that's a very interesting question that we tackle usually, and I tackle it as a professor for the international business and diplomatic protocol training that we do probably every quarter here in Washington, D.C. And that's where I teach professionals. And at that course, we have anything from ambassadors, diplomats, government officials to business leaders that they want to have the skill of cross-cultural communication. Effective communication is part of the personal diplomacy that each one of us should have, right? And there are parts in the world where one gesture can mean like a different thing that you'll ever think. So, for example, in Bulgaria and in Albania, for example, they say no as a yes and a yes as a no. I mean, they gesture it, right? So, like when they do like that, that means yes. And when they do like that, that means no. If you are not aware of this cross-cultural communication, because again, communication can be verbal or through signs, right? Or gestures. And you might be like you're trying to close a deal or you're trying to negotiate. You might be like afraid by that, right? So that's one thing. Another one is making sure that like there are different rules on how you hand out the business cards depending on who you are engaging with. If they are people from Asian nations or they are people here in Washington D.C. President Macron, for example, he likes to kiss women's hands, right? Because culturally that's appropriate in Europe. It's appropriate in a country such as France. However, it's inappropriate in a country such as the United States. This is not something that we do. So then how do you know how to play by these rules? Exactly. It's an entire course. I have my business etiquette secrets book available on Amazon also that kind of like gives out some of these secrets too. But for those who want to learn more about the cross-cultural communication, I invite you to the International Business and Diplomatic Protocol class.
Have you ever had the experience with either, a huge breakthrough when you managed to avoid a disaster, or on the other, witnessed or experienced a huge, failure, either comically or or tragically, regarding that?
Yes, I mean, I think throughout my entire life, and here's one thing that I know for sure. I couldn't have achieved all that I've achieved into the human rights field as a woman leader into a men's world, and engaging and talking with heads of states and heads of governments around the world. Being young, when I started in this field, I was young, right? Like a decade ago. So, I couldn't have achieved where I am in my point in my career without the skills of diplomacy and diplomatic protocol. And obviously, it's a learning process because a lot of these rules are not written. So initially, I started and I went to diplomatic protocol school in Europe, and then when I arrived to the United States, I realized there's no books or there's nothing to teach you out there like from the get-go how to not put yourself into embarrassing situations. And throughout my career, there's been probably just a handful of those, but I definitely help a lot of business owners who want to work in this field and diplomats to like avoid this type of situations, right? And to just give you an example, um, there's the clergy in specific countries, right? Like that, the Catholic leaders, the Orthodox leaders, and so forth, and many other major religion, they have titles the same like a royal will have, sometimes even more important. So I've been in situation where a State Department official has gone and has traveled to one country like that, and they were not received by the patriarch of that country just because they didn't know how to apply. And like in writing, you have to be very diplomatic and not only like have a good formal letter, but use all the correct forms of address. So it's very, very important that people, and otherwise, not only you get embarrassed, but the negotiations or whatever you're trying, the project you're trying to make right there can stop, right? Another embarrassing moment, I think it was on national television. Not a lot of people know about this, but a few years ago when the Abraham Accords were being signed here in Washington, D.C., by mistake, the Prime Minister of Israel was given the document to be signed in Arabic, and the Arabic letter was given in Hebrew, right? So here was a moment where that the entire Abraham Accord could have been stopped just by this, clerical error, let's say like that. But at the same time, in diplomacy, errors are not really allowed. Rules of protocol are very strict, and as you've seen, like many titles around the world, especially like for the royal families where they have all like these different sets of rules. So yes, it's just we need to be mindful out there and be culturally sensitive. That's what I would be to give a solution or suggestion to the audience today.
Indeed. And are there any tips for, let's say, you haven't had the chance to take a diplomatic protocol class, you find yourself in a strange country, in a business negotiation or a political negotiation as a relative newcomer, a new political appointee for a government you haven't been briefed, or you've been briefed on some very basic issues, but not nuances. How do you navigate? How do you pick up this? These elements if you don't even know what to ask necessarily.
That's a great question. So, I mean, there are often situations where, or even from like how to eat a specific food. And we do nowadays, we do business at the table too, right? So, I think as a rule of thumb, always ask. Don't pretend you know, even if you have been instructed priorly to your departure, right? You go into a country, again, don't necessarily like be the show off of things. I know we are Americans and we like to go in different parts of the world and, just a little bit like showing our American way. It's not only that, be culturally sensitive because in other parts of the world, people might have their way. So, customer is to ask like about the dress code, right? Is there a particular dress code? I'm sure you can find, let's say you're meeting with an official delegation, right? And the leader of that delegation, they have other staffers. It's okay to ask. You're not fumbling yourself. It's better to ask than just to be put in an embarrassing situation, right? I wouldn't suggest, and that's something that I totally not recommend searching on Google because you will be surprised of the amount of misinformation out there and the disputes and everything. Just rely on books, right? So one resource, I created the Business Etiquette Secret as a guide for everyone. It's not a novel. It's a guide for anyone to just have it handy whenever they need anything. But I'm not just talking about my book. There's other books, international. There are not many authors in the United States that talk about international protocol. They might talk about US protocol, right? So if you want to work internationally and not embarrass yourself, try to find different books out there that talk about international protocol.
So here's a little bit of a question before we move on from this, because, just because this is a kind of a fun topic. we have all heard and seen some of the stories of absolutely hilarious mistranslations. In one case, I remember when President Obama was visiting a state, there was a scandal with a translator who was either not doing the translation at all or mistranslating what was being said. But I'm sure that has happened in other situations as well. What happens if you get deliberately wrong advice?
That's I mean, what happens to me if like I get wrongly translated? Because it did happen to me in the past. So, I mean, here's one rule of thumb, right? And that's something that I teach and I preach. As a chief of protocol, right? Like the organizer of that event, it's your duty as an organizer to make sure you have the speeches in advance. I was hosting I was one of the organizers of the International Human Rights Summit at the United Nations every year before the pandemic, right? And there it's customary, we had the UN was having translations into multiple languages at the same time. But that doesn't mean that we weren't asking the speakers in advance for their speech, so to make sure that we are correctly translating, because sometimes live
Mhm.
interpretation can go wrong. And nowadays there's AI live interpretation. So, there we are trying to accommodate all our means. Now, for me personally, when that happened, I was lucky that it happened in a language where I kind of like know my way in, and I immediately understood. And specifically, my advice for speakers, right? Like those who are in Obama's shoes, let's say, or any other speaker that needs to get translated, is um, use plain language, plain, simple English, rather than trying to be sophisticated and use like specialized. I mean, I am a foreign, like I'm a lawyer, right? So I've been trained in specific legal terms. I try to avoid them at all costs. Even when I talk about human rights, sometimes depending on the country where I'm talking or the audience I have in front of me, I might use different words to mean the same thing, right? I might use sustainable development goals. I might use human rights, human security, diversity, inclusion, equity, any of these, right? So just be mindful, be culturally sensitive on how you do that speech. Don't try to like, put words out there that people that don't have a general knowledge will
Mhm.
have. Yes.
That's always good to keep in mind. Um, Are there instances when it's acceptable to bend diplomatic protocol? And I'm saying this. There's a show called The Diplomat, which is absolutely far from reality in any sense, and diplomatic protocol there seems to not exist. But in reality, are there instances when it is acceptable or even desirable to circumvent the formalities?
Yeah, so here's for the audience just general knowledge to have. There's protocol and there's etiquette, rules of protocol and rules of etiquette. Protocol, it's mandatory. You
Mhm.
are not allowed to like go by, like you have to go by it. You cannot just come up and like bend the rules there.
Mhm.
Etiquette, it can be changed, right? Because
Mhm.
nowadays we have everything for etiquette, even like elevator etiquette, saying hello when you get in and get out, right? So but in matters of protocol, states like countries have established themselves a specific protocol. And in the protocol, there are specific rules that get for like the titles, the forms of address, the order of precedence, right? Who's first in the country. And many countries have their different protocols because some countries have a president as the head of state. Others have a monarch, others have a prime minister, right? Commonwealth countries. So then you have to be aware of these differences, but just know that protocol, you have to go exactly as it is. You cannot, it's mandatory. While the etiquette, and that's the basic difference between the two, etiquette, it's something that you can just improve upon and it comes with ages. It is like rules of like how do we dress and how we eat. Those are rules of etiquette and they can change during like via times, right? As we grow and as, our society develops. But protocol, it's been there forever. It really hasn't changed that much. In most of the rules are written, most of the rules are there to be seen. So just make sure whatever your country you're traveling to, just consult the rules of protocol for that country. There's an order of protocol for each country in the world.
Well, that's good news to know, and I think those concepts do get confused a lot. So let's talk about more about civil society and its role in diplomacy. How has that changed over time, and to what extent uh to what extent is civil society becoming, an informal new face of global diplomacy, and how, and most importantly, to the extent that civil society is playing a bigger role, or more visible role? How do we keep that process from being corrupted by political intervention, by financial conflicts of interests, and by, basically other intervening factors?
Yeah, so I mean, I feel like the terminology of civil society has come and has developed as a solution to a problem, right? The problem was governments weren't able, because of their advanced bureaucracy, they weren't able to tackle particular problems. For example, like war situations. Nowadays, civil society organization, they get there on the ground much faster than the government, right? So sometimes the governments, like nowadays, the governments rely on the support of civil society. That's why they receive grants or they receive support from the government to go and be like the front runner, the grassroots activities, right? And that's what civil society is supposed to do. Now, in practice, there are a lot of, not there's the one percenters that are not going to do good things, right? They are there for another ulterior motive, right? We don't even talk about those. This is not the ideal. We are talking about the civil society organizations that really, really are there at the grassroots. They are helping with humanitarian aid. They are helping with negotiations. They are helping advocating for legislation change. They are helping do change, right? And then the government, in the end, is the ones who adopts those changes. And that's my viewpoint on that.
Indeed, the one percenters may not be all that much, but they can certainly do big damage. So hopefully their role will actually, they'll be easier to track and expunge.
It's our role as civil society, as part of the good civil society, right? To just out these other
Exactly.
society organization that probably like they don't do that good in the world, right? And through that, there are initiatives, there are like legislation, there are multiple ways on how we can achieve that.
More generally, though, besides the skepticism over the role of civil society, there's also been a growing skepticism over the role of diplomacy itself in either ensuring human rights or resolving any sort of crisis. Why is it that diplomats, tend to get a bad rap these days? And what does diplomacy with teeth actually mean in practice? How can it be effective? And uh, how can we overcome this perception that diplomatic processes are basically a road to nowhere?
Well, I don't necessarily agree with that. I've met and I work with so many, diplomats, not only US diplomats, but diplomats from all around the world. And I know for sure there's a lot on their agenda. Like they are given a very large mandate and probably they can do just 10% of that, right? They are sometimes overwhelmed of the amount of work that they need to do in order to promote their country's interests. Because for example, what an ambassador does is the representative of the president of that country into another foreign country, right? So they are supposed to like do treaties and just represent their country well. Now, when it comes to diplomacy with teeth, right? And there are many ways, and nowadays there are like modern diplomacy, business diplomacy, NGO diplomacy, and many other, parts of diplomacy that are not necessarily the governmental diplomacy. But talking strictly about, because your question addressed the government
Mhm.
diplomacy. Now, my opinion on that is the lack of education gets diplomats to be in situations where they don't know exactly how to act and react, right?
Mhm.
And what I mean, like, let's take human rights because that's my field, right? A lot of diplomats, they are trying to do advancement into a field of human rights, for example, but they've never been educated in human rights because guess what? In America and in many parts of the world, I actually like in every country around the world, there's only one country in this entire world that has mandatory human rights education. Do you know which one is that? That's Costa Rica. And it wasn't until 2021 when Costa Rica adopted a law that put mandatory human rights education in schools for all. So
Mhm.
now the question comes, how we can expect these leaders to know how to implement human rights for all if they've never been taught the 30 articles of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights?
That's
Kind of, our offices is located like 5 minutes from the White House, and I see often people with banners saying like stand up for human rights. How can you stand up for your rights if you don't know what they are? Because
mhm.
if you go right now on the street, and I've done this exercise, and I used to do it in New York also whenever we were having the International Human Rights Summit, randomly stopping people on the street and ask them what are human rights. Apparently, a very simple question that not many know how to respond to it. How many human rights we have? What are some of those? And people are often confusing human rights with civil rights, political rights. That's the problem. That's where we have to kind of like work in. And that's where I dedicated my life into. I felt this is a gap that needs to be filled. People need to be more educated because, as you mentioned previously, sometimes they are put into a job and they are not briefed enough, right? I know like spouses of ambassadors, they always come to me and they tell me there's a problem that they are put into a role because now they have responsibilities also as a spouse of an ambassador, men, women, doesn't matter, right? But they were never trained in diplomacy. So they come to the diplomatic protocol and etiquette training to be trained like that. I work with universities, marshals and chief of protocols because each universities, whenever they have foreign guests, they have to have a chief of protocol. So here it is like a world where we are expected to know diplomacy, the same like we expected President Trump to know diplomacy when he went to visit the Queen and all that. But we do not make an effort to teach our leaders in schools from when they are young these subjects, human rights and diplomacy. You know, where it's like we are expecting that we are going to learn, like my entire life, I've been lied to that I'm going to learn about human rights in law school. They say, you want to work in human rights? This is if you search on Google. You want to work on human rights? Go to law school. Guess what? Going to law school is not going to teach you human rights unless you do a special master after human rights law that is going to teach you about human rights. So it's like nothing in the world is so simple, but sometimes we focus too much on higher education and we forget about like values to the 9-year-olds, 10-year-olds. That's the age where they develop and they become the next leader. So if we want to have better leaders tomorrow, we don't like our leaders of today, that I feel that's the solution. And there are studies to back that up. Canadian studies, Indian studies, like studies around the world that show the impact of education on a young group.
And by the way, there are countries where formal diplomatic education is mandatory, and there are some people who are streamlined in the field. Whereas in the U.S., essentially anyone who passes a foreign service officer process can end up in that field. And there is some training, of course, but it's obviously not as formal or extensive as these diplomatic academies. So there is a huge also international gap and um miscommunication almost on what it takes to become a diplomat to begin with.
That's right. I agree.
So I'm going to ask you also something again a little bit provocative. Let's say you're dealing with a nefarious actor, either because you've just ended up in the same space for whatever reason, some international conference, or because it's part of your interaction, it's part of what you're supposed to be doing. What are some of the effective strategies for effective communication with a very well-known human rights abuser? Not just someone looking to, improve some processes and gain best practice experience, but seriously a very problematic country or individual or entity. How do you communicate? How do you manage not to turn this interaction into a disaster?
Yes, that's a very good and difficult question, and I've been faced with similar situations too. First of all, I think, and what I recommend is we always have in us this tendency of going straight to confrontation, right?
Mhm.
And that's the way straight to failure. We don't want that. We don't want a direct confrontation necessarily to like point fingers and like, this is what you do wrong, right? Find a common ground where you can have a discussion with that person and talk about like not necessarily, oh, let's change the world, because obviously that's not something that they want to do, but find out more, like ask question and find out more about their viewpoint. Here's what happens is communication, there's point A and point B, right? In like basic school communication, right? And then there's a way of communication by phone, via like face-to-face communication. Now, first of all, you need to use the same way of communication, because if that person sends you a letter, you're not just gonna necessarily go and like knock on their door, right? You might want to send a letter back. Sometimes this is the case. But let's say that person is in front of you. In that case, you will want to understand that person reality. So in order to achieve, both parties to achieve an understanding and better communication, you need to ask questions, like active listening and then asking question, so that you understand that person reality. Then acknowledge that reality. One mistake that we do often is, especially like for people who have been raised like in Europe and Eastern Europe, we just take everything from for granted necessarily, and we do not acknowledge the people, right? So let's say somebody's telling you, well, I've passed this legislation which you think is bad, but I think it's good. So you might want to say, oh, thank you for telling me why you think that is good, right?
Mhm.
So it's kind of like acknowledging the communication, showing the person in front of you that you've actively listened to their reality. And then it's a matter of whether you agree or disagree with that. You can voice your opinion. Yeah, I acknowledge you. Thank you for telling me that. Here's my viewpoint on this. Instead of like starting with like, well, I don't agree with this, right? Which is
Sure.
usually the way we communicate. We are very fast in our communication. And especially in diplomacy, that's what diplomacy teaches you, is you need to have that patience, that you obviously develop it in time, but you have to have that patience to be active listening. Madeleine Albright, first woman Secretary of State in the United States, right? She didn't even have to talk sometimes to express how she feels towards an opponent, let's say. She was wearing these pins, these brooches, right on there. I have a pin on my jacket from my
Mhm.
president's service award. So, I mean, they were she was expressing how she feels by wearing like flowers when she was in a good day and meeting with somebody great, or snakes and carnivorous animals, right? So it's a very interesting
I love
story to
it.
read about and see those. So diplomacy is not only like verbal communication, it's also the gestures and everything surrounding you, like the way you're portraying. Many times, again, as a woman in a men's world, many times people, let's say government diplomats, will look at me and say, like, who is she and why is she, allowed to be in the same room as us? And that's the perception. And the way I communicate then, that makes them realize that I know my things. I deserve to be there the same way they deserve to be there. So that's how it's a skill. You don't just grow it overnight. It just grows with time.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. I think many of our leaders, community leaders, political leaders, all of us could learn a lesson in that regard for sure. We've seen a lot of very, very bad, ineffective communications lately. But that brings me to a more general point of view. So, given this factor of effective uh, dealing with difficulties, what, in your opinion, makes an effective diplomat in general? Because we hear a lot from former diplomats and current political leaders about how great they all are and on claiming successes. But in reality, how do you measure success in individual capacity, not just, a policy that manages to convince the other side to adopt your point of view. That's a clear example, but on an individual level.
Well, on an individual level, I think a good diplomat is that person that first, like knows how to effectively communicate, has that cultural sensitivity. It's open to ideas, constantly willing to learn. I've seen many, unfortunately, in this field that they are like, okay, I've done my career, I've done my training, right? I've done my foreign agent education, foreign service education, and foreign, like education, and then that's it. It stops. For me, for example, it never stops, right? You might find me at courses myself, even if I teach and I have thousands, tens of thousands of students myself, right? So it's always like read those books, like get up to date with skills, be prepared to answer even the most difficult questions, and have this I would say humbleness, right? Humbleness into you that not only like, because it's not, and a lot of people are not arrogant, but they are not humble enough into like being open to understand others' opinions and have empathy towards anyone who you're working with. I feel these three are the most sought for qualities of a good leader, not necessarily a diplomat. And it is a matter of being firm and at the same time being friendly when doing that. And we have, leaders like that around the world that they were listened to, but they were feared at the same time by those who know that they were not having the best intentions, let's say like that.
You just pointed to something extremely interesting. You made this point about being firm but friendly, and this is exactly seems to be the opposite of US or even international politics in general. Either you have this excessive appeasement of trying to get into the good graces of whoever at the cost to real consequences for bad behavior or enforcement of red lines, or you're so busy blustering and trying to show how tough you are that you end up alienating even close allies. So how do we get back to striking that balance? Because we are seeing this extremely unprofessional sort of behavior from all political from parties and their respective diplomats from all political backgrounds. It's not just one particular side.
Yeah. I think being firm is easier than being friendly sometimes. And a lot kind of like get into that hole of, oh, I need to show that I'm serious. I'm very serious about what I do. And that's mostly like if you look at the European culture, if we are looking, for example, at the American, it's like we want to be friendly. We want to show that we are supportive of you, but then you are not firm enough. And that's like the battles of the brains, let's say. Well, in my opinion, again, it's a skill that grows with time. It's not something, and not everyone it's a native. It's like same like singing, let's say, as a career, right? Like you can be born with a talent, but that talent then needs to be worked upon. The same with like the best tennis player in the world still has a coach, right? And like football, like soccer players, also they have a coach. So it's very, very important that even though you're like at a top echelon, you're the president of the country, you have good advisors next to you because you might not know it all. That's the reality of it. So I feel like the better, like the more you're up in your career or you're like growing up into the levels of society and the levels of the governmental organizations, then you need to have more and more support. And that's how you do with like consultants. That's how you do with advisors or anything. Like surround yourself of capable people.
Mm-hmm. And are there any examples you could give of some, maybe well-known international public figures who actually have a good balance of that friendliness and firmness at the same time? And how,
Well, I mean, I gave the example of Madeleine Albright, which was one of my, person that I looked up to it. Similarly, Eleanor Roosevelt, the wife of former President Roosevelt, and also the promoter of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And it's a very, very interesting speech that she gave on in Paris Sorbonne before the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted, and that shows strength, that shows friendliness, and that shows that this is the way for democracy and human rights to begin with. So it's very, very important. I encourage the audience to read it up. It's called a Human Rights Speech in Paris by Eleanor Roosevelt. So I will look up to those examples. Obviously, these are my personal two examples. I feel like others might relate with other people, but for now, this is who I relate the most with.
Well, I certainly hope that people do identify a few figures for themselves that they can emulate, because I think diplomacy is an important art, not only in political sector, but also in just dealing with people in general. And there's um something that you can always emulate and use in your daily interactions. So coming back to US more specifically, we are well known for appointing political donors and other figures from a very, political, not necessarily professional career diplomacy as ambassadors. And a lot of the times these people have neither the cultural nor linguistic acumen, in the diplomatic corps, both at the top level and sometimes in general. To what extent is that a serious disadvantage, and how can that be circumvented?
That's an interesting question. I've seen more and more governments having their political appointees as ambassadors, let's say to a specific country, because they need to serve a particular agenda of that country. In practice and in diplomacy, there's not such a big distinction between a career diplomat, let's say like that, and a political appointee diplomat. Their role and their responsibilities and their rights while they are exercising that in that capacity are the same. Now, in matter of preparation beforehand, obviously a career diplomat has been had. So in order to like become an ambassador as a career diplomat, you have to get through certain phases of your career, right? Like you are not appointed directly ambassador. You start as a maybe first secretary, like a counselor, minister counselor, and therefore like you become an ambassador. So that means you have certain experience already in working for an embassy. However, I've worked and I had the pleasure to work with both, right? I'm not seeing necessarily in practice. It's just a matter of the personal diplomacy of that appointee, regardless, right? You can have like the best career diplomat, and in the end, they don't, you know, they are not like putting into work what they were taught in school, let's say like that, right? Like in diplomacy school. But you can have a political appointee that really it's open. It can be an expert in the field, right? I'm not sure about donors in particular, but they might be like I know instances where like experts in a particular field was nominated as the US ambassador to the UN, or or other institutions, right? So this is the reality. In practice, there's no difference on how we treat these ambassadors, right? They come and go, all of them. So it's always good to make relationship as a civil society also to with the staff at an embassy, not only with the ambassadors themselves too. And then I wouldn't say necessarily that the United States is the sole example in the world that puts their has political appointees as ambassadors. It's just it's a common practice, because believe it or not, there are not many people who want to start working in diplomacy anymore, and there's a lack of diplomats out there, and a lack of schools of diplomacy, and a lack of like preparing new diplomats. They don't want to enter in this field because it's probably not as financially rewarding as other fields, right? Like a consultant might make more money than an ambassador, unfortunately. And also, as an ambassador, you have to move your entire family to a certain area for a certain period of time. You don't know. You can be there for 4 years. You can be there for two mandates, like 80 years, or you can be gone in 1 year if your government felt like goes down and you're a political appointee. So it's really the reality. And talking with and having so many friends, diplomats in this field, is not as simple, and it's really a dedication. You need to be very dedicated to want to do that. So even if it's a donor or a consultant or anyone who, who has supported the government, that means they are still dedicated to do that, because otherwise you cannot be an ambassador. You cannot wake up one day and say, I just want the title, because it's too much work, and too much of a headache to do it just
Mhm.
for a title, right?
So is it fair to say that diplomacy has lost some of its prestige and luster? Is there any way to motivate people to go back to it? Is there a way to run diplomacy differently, perhaps for this new day and age, or are there different demands that make it more basically a different, almost a different profession from what it was, let's say, 100 years ago?
Yes. I feel like it's in waves, right? Now we are in a phase where the interest is low. People, they don't want to do that because they've seen, they are looking up to other industries, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
a matter of it's also like the whole media and the whole reality, like TV and media, how they are portraying all these diplomats, and people, they don't have the desire because they see bad examples, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's up to us also to promote the good examples in the world, and just for having, and I think at one point there were so many wanting to work in diplomacy, and they started to make those exams very, very hard, right? And
Mm-hmm.
now they made it so hard that like less people will be interested in spending their like years of their life to studying for that exam, with the hopes that they are gonna get it, and maybe they are not gonna get it. And so it became something that it's hard to achieve in today's society. And a lot of people my age and younger than me that just finished college, they prefer to work um, in a corporate environment, or they prefer to work as having their own NGOs or their own businesses as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, in that respect, we may be in for different times because the demands are certainly still there, and that kind of brings me to the point about back to the human rights sector. There are so many human rights issues around the world. Some of them clearly get a disproportionate amount of attention from the media, from the political class, from wherever. How can civil society ensure that there is equal, fair coverage for all sorts of issues? Is there any way to do that?
There are multiple ways. It can be as simple as talking with your neighbors, your friends. Like human rights start like in our environment, in our community. I know for sure. So doing the research on femicide in Latin America, I realized that so many people in the world have no idea what that is and how that affects us who are not living in like countries, right? So African nation is the first place in the world, and then Latin America. But then as the globalization starts, and then the migration, right? Like people are moving all over. They are importing mentalities that have that, right? Like the gender-based violence. So in order for us to make sure we are not getting into a point where, so just to give you an example, there are 5,000 cases of femicide in Brazil and 40 in Germany per year, right? But who is to say that if those people move to Germany, that's not the same is going to happen? So how can
Sure.
we as a society like help educate? I was very, very surprised traveling to Europe and in America also, that a lot of like the cases that there are right now, they are not considered femicide because there's no law on that. There's no policy on that also. So it's up to us as a society, as civil society, to teach the people around us through workshops, through informal gatherings, to going in a neighborhood, teaching our children in schools about human rights in general, not new rights, just human rights, basic human rights, like we are all born free and equal, no discrimination, right? Human rights like solves the number one problem in America, bullying in schools. There are statistics that show bullying stops 90% of the times in 10 seconds when a bystander intervenes, right? So it's just as simple as saying, hey, what are you doing there? Why are you like, arguing with that person and so forth? So it's just a million million ways on how we can all contribute to it. And it's just up to each one of us, the like how little or how much you want to do. Support a local organization, volunteer for a local nonprofit. These are all like ways on how we can all achieve the same goal.
Think there should be some sort of a mandatory U.S. civics training for new migrants, regardless of whether they're before. I'm not talking about the citizenship exam. I'm talking about newly entered migrants, whatever their status. Is there any way to
I
implement that?
I totally agree on that. That's one of my projects that I advocate for because every migrant should have like a set of human rights when they come to this country. They should be given like I mean actually myself I've been through the process of being naturalized, right? So I've been through the process when I got my green card. I've got like certain rights and mostly had to do with domestic violence. But how about teaching about all the other rights, right? People
Mhm.
have. I often work with migrants, I mean legal migrants, right, in the United States, and their children tell me that their parents are being unfairly paid. That's one of the human rights,
Mhm.
right? So how do we teach them that they shouldn't accept what they are given if there's a mandatory threshold for that? So yes, I do firmly believe that we should teach our jail system and our migrants who are coming about rights in general.
Another question I have a little bit also off the beaten track is how do we attract more diverse thinkers to this field? Because what I'm seeing is a lot of human rights organizations in particular tend to have the same types of people, and often they migrate from one office to from one organization to another, cross-pollinating, bringing in whatever baggage they've had, and it's kind of always the same sort of mentality and the same sort of background. So how do we make this field, the cross-section between civil society, human rights, more open to more different perspectives and more attractive to people from different types of backgrounds?
That's an interesting question. I often get like interns or like student interns and also like employees who have worked for other organization and now they work for us. Myself, I've been in the position of working with others and then I decided to go on my own and create the US Institute. So I feel it's just a matter of internal policies and how we view this to create a more diverse. I sometimes my employees come to me and they tell me the struggles that their friends have, right? Like in the like Muslims, for example, they are not allowed to have prayer times
Mhm.
or are at work. Like the holiday, we adopt a flexible holiday policy, right? So if you want to be free during Ramadan and not and work during Christmas, that's fine with me, right? So it's just a matter of valuing everyone's faith and conscienceless and belief, freedom of religion of belief, going back to that, right? So
Mhm.
that's another thing. And that's the essence of what a human rights consultant does. It's helping companies, organizations to implement these type of policies that allow a diverse group to come and like have the same values.
So here's kind of, in terms of lessons learned from your experience, what is the basic process of trust building? How do you establish trust with someone completely different? Because there are low trust societies, there are high trust societies, there are societies that are kind of in flux when there's a polarization. There are societies where building trust is the most important you know part of having a business or political relationship, much more so than any formal infrastructure. So how do you break that ice?
Well, first of all, I feel trust is a very, very important thing nowadays and an important skill to develop also. At USIDHR, everyone who comes through our doors, either a partner or when we sign an MOU or an intern or anyone who wants to work with us, we tell them that we value the following: have integrity, take responsibility, and keep your word. This is what trust mean like is for me. So as long as an organization or an individual is able to abide by these three things, then they can work with us. That means they have established a trust relationship. The moment they break one of those, right, they
Mm-hmm.
did something that show no integrity, or they didn't take responsibility for something they did wrong, or they didn't keep their word. That's the moment when that trust was broken, and that's the moment where you are no longer a part of USIDHR. So I feel like this is me. This is what we set up in place at my organization. Maybe there are other ways to do that there. I feel accountability, like personal accountability, is very important. If you want people to trust you, you need to show that you are personally accountable for your actions, for your reactions and actions. And then the same goes with organizations and institutions and governments. If you want to build trust in a institution or in a government, just make sure that you do what you said you're going to do. In the
Mm-hmm.
end, that's why people start to not trust you anymore, because they saw the reality is different.
Yeah, I can see how that contributes to basically the sort of distrust. And you know, on that note, given this importance of having these basic issues, US often carries a baggage of its foreign policy, partisan decisions, assorted preconceptions, whether they're right or wrong, and this more recent trend in this polarized discourse and polarized approach to different important issues. Is there any way to overcome that package for civil society members in diplomatic and human rights circles?
I just want to make sure that I correctly understood the question. Is it like the baggage?
Yeah, basically, a lot of people tend to judge Americans by their government's foreign policy, often negatively, and often it's also almost a little double standard. If US doesn't do something, why isn't US using its power to get involved? If US does something and doesn't go the way people like, they accuse US of interventionism and so forth. But regardless of how they view it, that foreign policy official baggage comes as a reputational damage almost to even regular civil society leaders trying to do their work. They're accused of being spies, US government agents, of, these foreign policy issues are projected on them. And of course, partisan decisions often color the entire foreign policy class because US has a democracy and it has different political parties that sometimes contradict each other's decisions. US is not highly trusted to have a consistent course of action. If you are coming as an American trying to be involved in diplomatic and human rights issues, how can you overcome these perceptions?
Yeah, I mean, I travel a lot and
Mm-hmm.
I sometimes get faced with tough questions, right? Like, what is going wrong in America, especially this summer? Uh, traveling throughout Europe, it was very difficult because I was in the US, and then, sometimes they will hear before I hear something because, the time zone difference. And sometimes, it's tough to, and I just take it situation by situation when it comes to me, like happening to me. I feel it in a sense you're right, right? Sometimes we are not portrayed, the American government, it's not portrayed as the best model in the world, right?
Mm-hmm.
And for that reason, some organizations or individuals might have issues in working. Now, us as the U.S. Institute of Diplomacy and Human Rights and any other U.S.-based organization, by law, we have to abide by the rules of the U.S. Department of State and like the policy of the State Department, right? We're
Mm-hmm.
not foreign agents, but uh, the American law, it's a little bit different than how like nonprofits are in other countries. So even if you're a nonprofit, completely independent, you still have to make sure, let's say I want to give a grant to a foreign
Mm-hmm.
organization, I need to make sure they are not a terrorist organization. It's my due diligence to do that,
Sure.
right? So I take that responsibility. Now, in regards of how do we answer to provocations from others, we always have to, obviously, I love my country, I love my flag, and like we portray ourselves as Americans too. But at the same time, I'm always open to understand the viewpoint of another person and then acknowledge them and then try to share my own viewpoint, my own stance on
Mm-hmm.
that.
So there is a way to overcome this um uh equation. Finally, I kind of wanted to wrap up with a few kind of a combination of some sort of a personal reflection from you on how do you measure the impacts that you want to make personally, and how do you identify ideal partners, and who do you consider your mentors and inspirations in this field? Not just the figures, but specifically in like real life matters, not just figures you look up to in politics, but in
Yeah.
terms of people who've helped guide you to where you are. And in that sense, what advice would you also give to others looking to follow your path?
Mhm. Well, I know for sure that for me, my passion, what like wakes me up in every single day in the morning is education for all, and especially for children, unprivileged children. So the statistics show there are 258 million children in the world, primary school education children, that don't have a chance at education, either because they live in a remote area or they are too poor, they don't have a backpack, they don't have uniforms, school supplies, and so forth. So we are trying our best, and I'm personally trying my best to try to achieve that goal. That's my goal. It can be big for some people. It can be, for me, it's achievable. I want to help 258 million children in the world to go to school. Right? That's my goal in a sense. Now, in matters of who I look up to, I did mention, Eleanor Roosevelt. And obviously, I do have mentors that I work with in different fields, because you have to have a mentor,
Mhm.
that not somebody that's good at everything, right? For me, in order to do my mission and expand my mission into multiple countries, was very, very important to learn about marketing, or it was very, very important to learn about how to operate a business efficiently, right? They don't teach you that in law school, right? It wasn't a skill that I got educated about. So now I'm like, working with mentors that are teaching me in those respective fields, right? Or as a nonprofit leader, also, I'm teaching others who want to create their nonprofits. Many of our students, they want to create their own nonprofits. I'm now helping them create their own nonprofits, incorporate them, and help them through the process based on the model. So some see me as the model, right? And then in matters of who we want to reach at the U.S. Institute of Diplomacy and Human Rights, we mostly focus on for our trainings. These are addressed to a professional audience, right?
Mhm.
So it's graduate student up from like master's level, and then professionals who are already working in the field, so that they improve their skills. It's a certified professional development certification. All of our certifications are CPDs. So then that's kind of like adding into getting those extra credits on how you can work and do a better job in your own field. So this is what we do.
Thank you so much for your time, for sharing this fascinating perspective on a world that I think many people see sort of from a distance, that's a little bit mysterious and at the same time enticing in certain ways, and a little bit intimidating at the same time. And I think you just made it a lot more accessible, understandable, and I think that actually will maybe hopefully inspire more people to explore opportunities and to dedicate their talents to helping others in these important areas. Thank you so much, and I wish you the best of success.
Thank you so much, Irina. And thank you also for inviting me and for trying to give your audience some positive things also, and help them understand this face of diplomacy that maybe sometimes they don't look at it
I
this
think
way.
I think a lot of the difference between positive and negative outlook is what skills you have to deal with it. Because I think a lot of the times people are just not prepared for challenges, and so they tend to view them as overwhelming. But once you discover that there's some things you can actually do to put yourself in a better position, they tend to be more optimistic, more confident, and have concrete goals that they can actually implement. And I think that in that sense, it's very useful.
That's right.
Thanks for everyone watching. We'll be back next week, Tuesday night, 9 p.m. The Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. Thank you for everyone who's joined us, and have a great evening.